Everybody, welcome to Topic 7 here of Unit 3, boycotts of the Olympics and World Cup and other things. This is sort of the pinnacle of what we've been talking about in this unit, when it matters most. And in this case, we're talking about times when countries, or IFs, have decided that they would skip a sporting event, threaten to skip a sporting event, discuss it, propose it, etc., to try and leverage political pressure on a regime to make certain changes, or to try and put pressure on an international federation to make some changes. And on the one hand, it might seem silly. It's basically a threat to not play in your games, right? I mean, and that seems to be sort of the base thing, a hollow sort of threat or a silly sort of threat. But in reality, because countries value the hosting experience, they value being seen as successful and they value being a host to the world, because of all that it brings with it, then not going to their event could be problematic, could be seen as problematic. And that happened throughout time in the Olympics and beyond. Now, most people sort of get the sense that boycotts are a more recent phenomenon of the Cold War. Certainly 1980 is the one that most Americans are familiar with, but boycotts go a lot further back than that. In fact, the first ones that were proposed were in 1936 with the games in Nazi Germany. Some people, when they read histories of World War II or the lead up to World War II, they'll read histories that aren't as in depth and sort of get the perception that people didn't really know what was going on with fascism and the Jews in Nazi Germany, but it was pretty widely known amongst people who were paying attention. And there was widespread proposals both in the United States and the United Kingdom to boycott the Olympic Games. Now, as you know, that didn't happen. There was an attempt to have an alternate Olympics, the Olimpiada Popular in Spain in 1936. It would be sort of a leftist version of the rightist games in Germany, but this is the first time when boycotts are discussed. So there was a realization that Hitler wanted validation. Right, he's going to do all of those things with the monumental architecture, with the torch relay, and all those sorts of things because he wants to show forth the greatness of his regime and his ideology. So if you skip it, it's seen that that might be an insult. But we decide not to do it, in part because the main movers and shakers in the Olympic movement are those who are still pretty well committed to the idea that politics and sport don't mix, even though, as we know, they do. The first time there were real boycotts, real people staying away from tournaments for political reasons, was actually almost entirely related to sport. So this is World Cup 1966. It's hosted in England, and the fellow here seen kicking the bell, his name's Eusebio, one of the most famous soccer players of all time. He was Mozambican. So he's born in East Africa when Mozambique was still a colony of Portugal. So remember that decolonization process that starts in 1957 with Ghana becoming independent, lasts several decades. The last country to give up any of its possessions in Africa was Portugal. So that meant that the nationals who were born in the colonies were allowed to play for Portugal, the mother country. And Eusebio then was this African playing in the World Cup, the best player in the world at the time, in that tournament at least. Pelé was better maybe before and after, but not in 1966. Everyone in Asia and Africa boycotted the World Cup. Every country, independent country in Asia and Africa, boycotted that World Cup because FIFA only allotted one spot in that tournament to them. And they thought it was unfair that there were that many federations that really wanted the recognition of playing in a World Cup and they weren't allowed to play. The exception to that was North Korea. North Korea was an unknown sort of country. It didn't have a lot of people who knew what was going on there. They're only about a dozen years out of the Korean War at the time. And here they came to the World Cup and became this sort of fancy, darling, unknown side that's only playing there because everyone else boycotted. And they didn't play any qualifying games. No one had ever seen any of their players play when they show up at the World Cup. So there's sort of a famous moment when the African in the tournament, who happens to play for Portugal, a European country, plays against Asian country, the only Asian country in the World Cup. And that sort of dynamic happens because of a boycott. And by 1970, they had fixed it. There was at least two spots, and it gets a little better from then out. But that was the first time there was a formal boycott, and it was actually for sporting reasons. And you could say that there's political reasons inherent in there as well, because those nascent countries want the right to appear. But it wasn't for, say, poor performance or poor actions on the part of the English, certainly not. There were discussions, though, of boycotting the Mexico City Games, but this is, again, not because of what Mexico City was doing or Mexico was doing in 1968, but it was because of the way race relations were playing out in the United States. So this is the heyday of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Martin Luther King proposed a boycott in 1967. He said that all people who were black should not participate in the games. He was mostly talking about the United States. Would have been happy to pick up some allies. And there's a bonus bit here of him calling for that boycott. As you know from two other times we talked about already, the boycott doesn't transpire, and that leads to the chance to have the Black Power salute, that very powerful, iconic moment when there is this ability to make a separate political statement, which would not have been possible in the instance of a boycott. Which doesn't mean that his idea was a bad one. It just means that you lose the chance to make that sort of statement if you skip the opportunity to be there. The widest boycott early on, the one that had the most countries and got the most notoriety in terms of an Olympic Games, was in Montreal in 1976. And this actually has something to do with what we had talked about before. So on the right is a map borrowed from Wikipedia that shows the countries that boycotted the Olympics that year. So what they were upset about was actually the unwillingness of the IOC to ban New Zealand from the Olympics. Now, this is a little strange, right? So by 1976, so you should remember from your work on the Isolating South Africa assignment, most South African teams in most sports have been isolated. One of the places that wasn't isolated was rugby, when they were isolated from most of the world, but not from New Zealand. New Zealand actually continued to play rugby against South Africa for many years after everyone else had boycotted them. And what the African states wanted was for the IOC to put pressure on the New Zealand folks because of their unwillingness to put pressure on the South African folks, right? So the African states, because they're mad at the IOC, say they're going to boycott the games if they don't ban New Zealand from participating. The IOC counters and said that at the time, actually 2016 will be the first time we have the rugby in the Olympics for the better part of a century. Because rugby isn't in the Olympics, they said they had no wherewithal to take action. It wasn't an IF that was in there, that if it had been judo, or if it had been ping pong, or if it had been gymnastics, then they could have taken action. But because of rugby, they could not. So the African states stayed home with a few others, a few other states as well, and there's a collective yawn. It's a bummer during the opening ceremonies, but all that happens is everyone wins more medals and they go about their business. And so it's sort of a shame. But because those states don't have a lot of wherewithal in terms of their television audience, their corporate sponsorships, their money spent on advertising, or the travelers who come to the games, there's not a big tangible loss to the bottom line. There's a sort of it's too bad you're not here sort of conversation, but there's no real bottom line threat. So the IOC didn't ban New Zealand. People didn't really care that the African states skipped, and on we went. The question, though, came is if regionalism would destroy that, you would in fact have to start having 5 separate Olympics for the different regions. And that was a conversation that people became worried about, because this was strictly one continent with a couple of other supporters trying to do something. Well, in 1978, you had a World Cup in Argentina. I've alluded to this one before, way early in the semester. This is when the Argentine military junta, which came to power in 1976, happened to be hosting the World Cup in 1978. And they used this sort of looming deadline to carry out all of their heinous actions that are part of what's called the Dirty War. The Dirty War is something that is waged against anyone of the left in their country, anyone who's deemed an enemy of the state. It's extrajudicial, meaning you don't arrest people and put them on trial. It means you disappear them. And so this Niños Desaparecidos symbol down here, these are a group of women known as the Mothers of the Disappeared, and the Abuelas, the grandmothers of the disappeared, who would march in the Plaza de Mayo, which is a sort of a main square in the capital city, to protest that their people would just disappear. You wouldn't know what had happened to them. And as many as 30,000 people were disappeared during the Dirty War in the run-up to the World Cup. They're going to do this because when people come to the tournament, they want them to be, they want them to see a peaceful, progressive, upright sort of country, and so they're gonna control people as quickly as they can. They would control people anyway. They didn't do it only because of the World Cup, but the World Cup speeds it up. So there are conversations that are up the World Cup that perhaps they should boycott, that they should not go to the World Cup, particularly because the Argentine military and police and other paramilitary forces weren't particularly careful about who they picked up on the street and disappeared. So there were Europeans being picked up and disappeared as well. And so it wasn't just a sort of thing where because Argentines are being punished, we should boycott. But sometimes they're saying because our citizens are being punished, we should boycott. But in the end, nobody boycotted. And there was a chance to get the message out a little differently. One of the Dutch players who played in the final, he happened to go marching with the Mothers of the Disappeared, and that got their story out on the news, and it sort of got things out and going differently. Long-term effects, not really any. There was no boycott, but it was one that if you say going forward, if you won't boycott a country that's doing this in the World Cup when they're hosting it, maybe there's no justifiable reason to boycott at all. Except we came up with one. The United States boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics, and we didn't decide to do this until the winter spring of 1980. And we did it in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which happened in late 1979. So the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. We wanted to get them out. We wanted to express displeasure. And this was the first time that the Soviets were going to host an Olympic. It was seen as a big deal, this hosting for legitimacy sort of idea. Moscow's the host, and we decide that we're going to boycott. And it's interesting because now it's seen as, we actually boycott, and we lead a boycott of a lot of other Western teams as countries as well. I think something like 50 countries actually boycotted in the end. It's kind of popular when it's first announced. It's like, yes, let's stick it to the Soviets. Let's not go to their party. Let's not go legitimize them. Let's tell them how upset we are. But when the stories start trickling out about the athletes who don't get to go compete in the 1980 Olympic Games, the narrative flips and people regret the boycott of the 1980 Games, particularly after that Miracle on Ice event happened that we talked about in that lecture or two ago, when we have those sort of national pride moments, and you realize we're not going to have college kids go to Moscow and win there to sort of rally around. We lose that opportunity because we skip. So we did boycott. That's the second Olympics in a row that had a major boycott. And the Soviets went ahead and had a big party, which we did in 1984 when they decided to boycott us because we had invaded a small island nation called Grenada that's in the Caribbean. And they had a socialist regime come to power. There were some hinky things going on, nothing too serious, but we decided to invade this tiny little island state, and so they lead a boycott of states, much like we had led in 1980. And so what do? Well, we win a whole bunch more medals and have a great time. And yeah, it's sort of a shame because you don't get to have those Cold War narratives the same way you did. But boycotts, after 76, 80, and 84 all saw boycotts, the reality was that nobody really cared. Now, some people cared. There were different bottom lines that happened when different things transpired. When you had less in 80 or 84, but overall, it's just sort of a shameful thing. The question was whether you continue to have Olympics or not, or boycotts or not. And that's one of the reasons why that Goodwill Games alternative came forward that I talked about last time. The future of boycotts is tricky. There have been boycotts proposed for every Olympiad since, winter and summer. There's been boycotts proposed of almost all World Cups since. But because of the odd nature of what happens when you don't go, then people are loath to actually do it. So they'll continue to call for it because it's that significant political step, but they'll fail to follow through with it by and large because of what it entails for their own athletes. And it's sort of an opportunity lost, and they're going to have the event without you. So they'll continue to propose it. So we've got these two ideas on the table right now, that the World Cups in 2018 in Russia and 2022 in Qatar should not be held. Well, why? Well, there's multiple reasons, both for sporting reasons and political reasons. First, there's suspicion, and some of it's probably going to be proven over the course of the next several years, that both Russia and Qatar bribed their way to winning the game. So that's a sporting complaint. Then also you have Russia having invaded Ukraine and taken over Crimea, and the question is whether you should justify their actions by having the rest of the world come pay attention and have a great party in Russia. Is that right or wrong? And also because of their legal system, which is outlawing homosexuality, and what happens to athletes and fans who go into that environment. And so there's a lot of people who say you should boycott Russia in 2018. Qatar 2022 is even more extreme. First, because there's even more allegations of bribery and even stranger human rights context, but also for sporting reasons, that it's summertime in Qatar is ridiculously hot, and it'd be very difficult to play a World Cup there. Ultimately, though, that one's about workers and how many people will die, not because the regime is murdering people like the Argentines did in 1978, or 76, 78, or the Russians might be doing with their army in Ukraine or the Crimea, but because of the way they treat their workers. And this story is one that has blown up over the last year and a half, to look at what Qatar's treatment and their system of how they work actually workers to death is. And so should you justify then that World Cup with them in it? So there are political questions and sporting questions. And I urge you to watch the bonus bit there about Qatar 2022 and their treatment of the guest workers and what's going on there. Boycotts abound. Proposals for boycotts abound. Boycotts are more rare than they used to be. And they're more rare than they used to be because the dominant narrative is one that ends up being against the regime that proposed or enacted the boycott in the first place. It's supposed to be leveled. It's supposed to be something that puts pressure on the host that you want to change their ways. What has ended up happening in the past is it backfires on the regimes enacted them. Certainly, Jimmy Carter and his administration were excoriated because they prohibited American athletes from participating. It's available, but it's highly unlikely to succeed.